Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. We're meeting virtually across vast country, and so I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm currently working on the land of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal people who are joining us today on this webinar. Just by way of quick introduction, my name's Wei Jo. I'm one of the principal lawyers at Fitzroy Legal Service, and I'll be facilitating this discussion exploring the drivers of women's growing rates of remand in Victoria. I'm joined today by a panel of women who have expertise in women's criminalisation. So Emma Russell, Jill Faulkner, Anna and Sara. Emma is a senior lecturer in crime, justice and legal studies at La Trobe University. Her research and teaching aims to challenge carceral logics and elevate anti-carceral movement histories and futures. She is the co-author with Bree Carlton of Resisting Carceral Violence, Women's Imprisonment and the Politics of Abolition, published in 2018, and also the author of Queer Histories and the Politics of Policing, published in 2020. Anna is a criminalised woman and a member of the Women's Leadership Group, an arm of Women Transforming Justice, whose membership is women with lived experience of criminalisation. Anna is using a pseudonym today and has her camera switched off due to the stigma attached to having a CRN, which is a criminal records number. Sara has been a member of the Women's Leadership Group of Women Transforming Justice since late 2018. Sara has a passion for the rights of all women and working to change the systemic structures that cause harm and destruction in women's lives. And Jill is a grassroots worker of more than 30 years. Her thinking and work is shaped by the multiple relationships and storied journeys shared with First Peoples of Australia in rural and remote landscapes, women and children responding to the interpersonal and systemic violence, and more recently working to disrupt the gendered discrimination of women in the prison industrial complex. Jill is the co-author of Intersecting Stories, Narrative Therapy, Reflections on Gender, Culture and Justice, which was published this year in 2020. Thanks so much for joining us, Emma, Sara, Anna and Jill. Emma, you recently co-authored a report with Bree Carlton, Danielle Tyson, Wei Jo, Megan Pearce and Jill Faulkner entitled A Constellation of Circumstances, the Drivers of Women's Increasing Rates of Remand in Victoria, which looks at the particular way in which Victoria's bail laws impacts upon women. Can you kick us off and tell us about how you went about your research and what you hoped to achieve?
Sure, thanks Wei, and hi everyone. I'm speaking from Wurundjeri country today, and I also want to pay my respects to elders of the Kulin Nation and acknowledge also that, you know, the topic that we're speaking about today, which is bail and remand for women, absolutely impacts disproportionately on Aboriginal women. We wanted to do this project because we wanted to deepen understandings of why more and more women were going into custody on remand. And when we were having early conversations with members of the research team, I have a distinct memory of Megan Pearce, who's one of the co-authors at Fitzroy Legal Service, just saying, you know, we just need people to sit in the courtroom to track and bear witness to the reasons why women aren't getting bail. So that's kind of what we did, or that's what we set out to do. We ended up conducting 100 hours of observation in the bail and remand court at the Melbourne Magistrates Court. And so we ended up being able to observe the hearings for 34 women during that time. And these were women that were applying for bail or who were finalising their criminal matters in the bail and remand court. We also interviewed 13 criminal defence and duty lawyers to deepen our understanding of whether the kind of trends and issues we were witnessing in the court were reflected in lawyers' day-to-day practices working on women's bail applications and criminal matters. And then we're also able to analyse some prison entrance data from Corrections Victoria and also some data from the Bail and Remand Court, some of which is differentiated by gender, some of which wasn't, but it gave us a bigger picture of the principal issue, which was massive growth in rates of remand for women and increasing numbers of women being brought before a magistrate to make a decision on their bail. So the main findings from the research, should I speak to those way now quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be really helpful.
So our main finding is that there is a constellation of injustices for women that are really social and systemic in nature rather than kind of individual risks or problems. So principally these are homelessness, poverty, gendered violence, trauma, racism, lack of access to consistent and appropriate health services, and more. Yet, as we saw in the courtroom and as lawyers reiterated, police will almost always oppose bail in the court. They will argue that a woman should be incarcerated regardless of whether she represents any kind of risk to community safety. And due to some changes to the Bail Act in 2018, many more women are being shot up to the highest threshold for bail. So they have to show exceptional circumstances in order to be granted bail and to avoid remand into custody, despite their so-called offending typically being lower level. So the example we heard over and over again from lawyers was that someone accused of repeat shoplifting is now subject to the same legal test as someone accused of murder. And in our sample, the women subject to this test of exceptional circumstances were much more likely to be remanded than those that were subject to the lesser test of showing compelling reason why they shouldn't be bailed. There's also the risk for women caught in this expanded net for the toughest test that exists for bail, that they will end up with a short prison sentence on their record by virtue of having, by receiving time served when it comes to their sentencing after they've served a short stint on remand. Or it can be that pleading out their charges, so pleading guilty in the first instance, will seem more appealing in order to avoid having to go through that really difficult legal test of showing exceptional circumstances, or that's difficult for some women in particular to show. And while it's not outlined in the main findings on this slide here, I also just want to mention that we also found that legal representation seems to have a significant impact on women's bail outcomes. So 10 of the women in our sample did not have a lawyer representing them when they applied for bail. And in weekend sessions of the court in particular, women were often representing themselves, and that was correlated with worse outcomes for these women, so more likely to end up in custody on remand.
Great, thanks, Emma. Now, Sara, from your perspective, what do you see are the key issues that contribute to women's criminalisation?
Thanks, Wei. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It has been mine and other women's experiences that have helped me understand that the key issues usually stem from difficult experiences in childhood that could include experiencing sexual abuse, physical, emotional, and verbal abuse. And for many, it could also involve directly experiencing the abuse or watching it happening to a loved one. For others, the experiences of neglect and abandonment are also felt as traumatic. Living in a dysfunctional household and not having the love, support, and nurturing that children and adolescents need to develop and thrive plays a strong role in our path as we become adolescents and adults. There are many women who were placed in state and out-of-home care. When these events happen to children and young women, it is a short step to find that you are homeless, with nowhere safe and secure to stay. Being homeless comes with many risks and often builds on the trauma that began when women were younger. Experiencing trauma when you are a child or a young person means that you are more vulnerable to experiencing mental health issues. For many women, the effect of trauma means that your behaviour is often in fight, flight, or freeze, and healing from these many experiences of trauma does not happen. Both the trauma and the impact on you is unaddressed. Many criminalised and non-criminalised women become stuck in a pattern of fleeing relationships where their partner is enacting violence on them. This means that you are often homeless, unable to support yourself, and extremely distressed. Living with these ongoing abusive and distressing situations without adequate responses can lead you to looking for relief and engaging in substance use as a way of supporting you day to day in your life. Most women have been through domestic violence, have had their mental health impacted, and using substances are also experiencing financial hardship, often with no or low income. There are many varying factors for women. However, though from my own personal experience and that of many women I know, these are common themes in the lives of women who have been criminalised.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a lot to unpack there, and thanks so much for sharing that experience. Can I turn to you now, Anna? What do you think needs to be changed in order to decrease the increasing incarceration of women?
Thanks, Wei. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we variously meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. As we just heard from Sara, it's a really, really big topic, and it's hard to talk about what needs to change just in a short 5 minutes. But I think what we all need to understand really is that, criminalisation and incarceration is a really blunt non-solution to complex social issues. And, we're talking about this in the context of the bail laws, which were a reaction really to the violence of men and have had a disproportionate effect on women. And so I keep saying, well, the bail laws need to change. And the response I keep getting is there's no appetite to change the bail laws. So I think somehow we really need to encourage an appetite to change the bail laws, because once someone is in the system via bail, it's really hard to step away from continuing to be in the system. And to do that, we also really need to look at policing and prisons as, a solution to these complex problems. They're just not. The idea that incarceration is the solution, it's just the wrong place to start from. And last year, the Victorian 2019-2020 budget for prisons was 1.8 billion to keep up with the pace of demand. That was what was that was what Corrections published. And I'd really like to see a refunneling of funds into something that's effective. And a perfect example of that at the moment is what's happening with the Flemington Towers. Which incidentally the police made a public settlement to in 2013. So there's a housing issue which is a massive problem. And last night we were told that this is not a policing plan, it's a health and safety plan in response to the number of police that have been put into the towers. And that's just a contradiction. If it was true, there would actually be health and safety people in those towers, not police. So Emma's already said this is systemic, and there are multiple systemic issues, but we need to start with our thinking and start thinking about where the power and the money is going, I believe.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point, and certainly see it playing out in this context and in other contexts as well. Jill, can I just turn to you for a minute? You were also one of the report authors, and in the report, there was a comment that the so-called risks that women present within the courtroom are not indicators of community safety concerns. Instead, they are more likely to index women's disadvantage and marginalisation. Are you able to comment on this point?
Yes, Wei, but first I'd like to acknowledge that I'm also speaking on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and also the multiple acts of resistance that continue in the face of ongoing policies of colonisation. And I think, Wei, when we ask this question, there are some things that leap out for me around deconstructing, what in fact is the notion of risk to community? What's our response to low-level offending, which is often associated with survival? And what would mitigate that risk? What does the construction of safety look like for both the individual and community? It has me thinking about the criminalisation of poverty and social disadvantage. So how do we understand from our often very privileged locations the very skills of survival in an environment where the most basic needs such as housing, food and safety are not afforded to folks? Is poverty a criminal offence? Then there's the gendered experience of the interconnectedness between family violence, mental health and alcohol and drugs. The relationship between the violence that takes place in a woman's home, making it the least safe space, the impact of these physical and psychological assaults on mental well-being, and the notion of relief from suffering through drug use, whilst not wanting to collapse the complexity of these compounding experiences. There is nevertheless a connection that often positions women more vulnerable to criminalisation. And then there's the responsibility for social issues, the experience of which determines a person's well-being. Is that a state responsibility or is it an individual responsibility? The question of blame and allocation of responsibility is imbued in social attitudes where hierarchical structures construct norms around behaviour and expectation. Within these binarized constructions also come values around who's deserving and who's not, even in access to basic human rights. So I think what the report highlighted was that since the changes to the Bail Act, more women whose offending is generally at lower levels are required to meet compelling or exceptional circumstances. When we look at the context of the lives of those women appearing in court, we can understand the very nature of their day-to-day experience. Of those women we observed, more than 1 in 3 were homeless or living in unstable accommodation. The majority were unemployed. Almost 30% were referred for forensic assessments. An additional 20% had a diagnosed mental illness. 17% were primary caregivers of children. An additional 34% mothers of children not in their care. There was really a family or caseworker present in the court. It was interesting for me that at times there's a cursory mention where we know little about the presence or effects of family violence, abuse and subjugation in women's interpersonal relationships. We knew even less about the cumulative experiences of discrimination across multiple social domains: race, culture, colour, class, sexuality, performance of gender, ableism. These cultural contexts, so informing of women's experiences, seemed of little account to the court. We can talk about the weave of social disadvantage that increases vulnerability to criminalisation. However, there's also that irrefutable context that informs the decision-making in the criminal justice system. I read comments by magistrates which really demonstrate attitudinal positions. How is this person going to comply with the bail conditions if they just are couch surfing? I'm not satisfied that you've demonstrated exceptional circumstances. It's a very high level of satisfaction that the law requires of me, and I don't even know where you live. Homelessness is obviously a significant barrier for seeking bail. However, when we have an extreme public housing shortage with extensive wait lists, low numbers of social housing stock, many people precluded from the rental market, much of our limited rehab housing with high levels of compliance and monitoring, and women experiencing homelessness as a response to interpersonal violence, the question surely is, what is our social responsibility to ensure access to housing for even the most vulnerable in our communities? These risks are reflective of individuals being held responsible for the failings of a social system to provide safe, secure, and stable housing for those in need. This failure can result in women serving custodial time, often dead time, longer than their sentence time. We've only to look at the comparison between spending on social housing and investments in prisons, as Anna reflected, to understand this predicament. mental health is reported to be a risk factor, and yet noted in the report, mental health services advise that you're better off in custody because there's little guarantee in the community that you'll be treated. Police are reported to have commented she will benefit from some time in jail so she can receive adequate drug treatment and rehabilitation. Is this our response? Mental illness can be a response to overwhelming threats to safety, survival, across multiple personal and state-sanctioned domains of abuse and violations. It reflects a high level of experiential distress. Many women presenting with mental unwellness also hold histories that are shaped by child sexual abuse, family violence, and systemic abuses. Is it just to hold women in custody because the state has not been able to respond to the complexity of women's lives? That prisons could be considered our biggest mental health provider is really an issue for all of us. Women referred to drug and rehab services often faced a wait list and may be accommodated in services framed within an abstinence model of recovery. This may not fit for all women who face little other alternatives. A breach of the conditions is a pathway to further criminalisation. My sense is the gaze is being diverted from government, social services and criminal justice systems and embedded in the notion of individual responsibility for these women.
Thanks, Jill. So Emma, Jill's touched on a lot of intersecting factors that she noticed during her observations in the court. Were there any other particular trends or cases that you observed during the fieldwork component of your research that stand out that you'd like to add to?
Yeah, I mean, a lot has been covered by Jill and Anna and Sara, so thank you, particularly those themes around homelessness, family violence and the criminalisation of poverty. So maybe what I'll do now instead is talk about a couple of cases that we observed in the court that sort of bring together or crystallise how these themes kind of play out. So I'm thinking of a few examples. So one woman we observed in court, she had been arrested and brought before the bail and remand court for breaching a personal safety intervention order. And that intervention order prevented her from attending her local shopping centre. And this was a woman that had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and she was attending this shopping centre and begging, asking people for money at the shopping centre, and security was called on her and she ran away and police were called, and then she was arrested for breaching her intervention order. There were several instances of women being brought before the court for repeated shoplifting, often, very small amounts being taken very non-violently and unthreateningly. So, one woman who repeatedly would, for example, go to a bottle shop and take a bottle of wine and walk out. And then she ends up in court facing the absolute highest test to prove that she shouldn't be going to custody. Very tragically, during the period of our study, we learned of the preventable death of a Yorta Yorta woman, Veronica Nelson Walker, who was remanded in the bail and remand court on New Year's Day this year, also on shoplifting charges. We didn't observe her case, but I do want to highlight it here because it absolutely brought home the urgency of addressing these problems while we're doing this study, because, while it might seem like a kind of mild sanction to be going in and out of prison for a day or 2 days at a time, it can actually be lethal and hugely impactful and harmful for women that are already marginalised in the community. As the other speakers have already mentioned, alongside the criminalisation of poverty, we noticed that women's experiences of family violence were very rarely taken seriously in their bail hearings and very rarely taken into account. So this was even when it seemed quite exceedingly obvious to us that this was relevant and that it represented a really profoundly gendered injustice. So there was one case that we observed, which is outlined as case study 5 in our report, where a 24-year-old mother of 3 was arrested following reports that she'd been assaulted in a car. And when police attended the incident, she was non-responsive to their questions and wouldn't comply with their questioning. And so then police arrested her for breaching an intervention order, which was in place, where the father of her children was the protected party. And so she was arrested even when she had a cut to her face and bruising from the assault. And then in her bail hearing, there was no mention of this victimisation in her application for bail. And so lawyers, really reiterated to us in their interviews that family violence is probably the most significant gendered factor in criminalisation and remand. So, while criminalised men absolutely experience homelessness, addiction, mental ill health at really high rates, it's women that disproportionately experience family violence victimisation, which really compound all of these other issues. So these entanglements between family violence, homelessness and criminalisation absolutely requires further research and investigation, and also consideration in the courts, and of course, interventions long before women get to the point of being brought to court.
Thanks, Emma. So there's been a lot of talk about homelessness and criminalisation. Sara, could I ask you to talk through what you see as being the links between those two things, so criminalisation and homelessness for women?
Yep. The majority of women who are criminalised have been homeless and often are substance dependent. There's also a lot of domestic violence experiences that lead to homelessness, and this can impact your ability to be approved into private housing, whether you can be bailed or forced to serve your remand in custody. Public housing waiting lists are extensive. Homelessness for women also means that their children will be removed. The grief and loss experienced by mothers is enormous and further adds to the distress and mental health instability of women. By the time you have slipped into homelessness, your life is about survival. You are forced to do whatever you can to live each day. This can involve selling drugs, having sex with men for a roof over your head, and small survival crimes to eat. This then leads to custody and often refusal of bail because you have no stable housing or can't get a bed in a rehab, and then the cycle continues. The housing crisis leaves women extremely vulnerable, and in these dire circumstances, women are experiencing they need support and a safe home, and for the system to recognise prison is not a home or a place for mental health treatment or drug rehabilitation. Homelessness is not a crime. We need to stop locking women up who are homeless.
Thanks, Sara. And so you also talked about that that link between homelessness and family violence, and then also impact on children. I might go back to you, Jill, because you talked a little bit about family violence earlier. Now, the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, which was conducted in 2016, their findings showed that about 80 to 90% of all women in prison had experiences of violence. Obviously, there's a connection there that's clear between women's criminalisation and an experience of family violence. Are you able to talk us through that a little bit more?
Sure. I think central to talking about gendered violence is to note, like, we've disappeared the intersection between structural and systemic violence and interpersonal violence. So our discourses around gender violence are really located in interpersonal and intimate partner violence. And then in this context, the police are the responders to this as a social issue. And I think the challenge is to be able to have strategies and interventions that really assure the safety of survivors of domestic violence, but don't strengthen our oppressive and criminal justice apparatus. And I think this is particularly relevant because women are appearing in front of a patriarchal legal system when applying for bail. Aboriginal women are uniquely marginalised within a patriarchal and settler colonial legal system. And I think gender violence is certainly not neutral in its effects. So when the court doesn't necessarily take account of the effects of domestic and family violence for a woman, there's little understanding that's exercised around responses of women to long histories of violation and their subsequent use of violence as defensive or resistive at times. Many women report often that their partners have rung the police and they've been labelled as the perpetrator. And I guess once a woman's been misidentified, a closer relationship with criminalisation occurs. The service system's premised on a foundation of binarised constructions of victim-perpetrator, and women acting outside of these kind of normalised conceptions of how gender gets performed generally aren't eligible for what we have as victim-oriented domestic violence services. So the misidentification and the consequential criminalisation of women has really become a significant issue as well. The failure of police to identify the person most in need of protection can result in dual arrest and cross orders, women named as respondents, harmful justice responses in Aboriginal communities and communities of colour. There's often vexatious applications for intervention orders and criminalisation of breaches. Criminal charges often for women with no prior history. Of course, there's the separation, as Sara spoke about, from children, and the trauma for both the children and mother. A loss of housing, which then kind of strengthens our link with homelessness, no access to those victim-oriented services, often visa rights challenged, serious economic and social costs, and implications for VOCAT, and then increased vulnerability for harm. So I think what stands out for me is that without a nuanced understanding of the complexities of women's lives, violence as a social issue has landed within the parameters of the criminal justice system and really has had unintended consequences for women as victim survivors. That's led to their increased criminalisation.
Thanks, Jill. So what seems to be really clear to me that's an emerging theme is just the interconnectedness that's really rooted deeply in a sense of patriarchy and the impacts that the patriarchy has on women and how that plays out in terms of how the justice system deals with them. And Anna, earlier you talked about how any response needs to be absolutely systemic. Building on your earlier response, can you speak to us about what the criminal justice and service system need to consider in order to properly respond to criminalised women?
Is that me, Wei?
Yes, Anna. Yeah, thank you.
Right, okay. Thanks, Wei. I guess I'd like to start by saying that we really need to understand that you can't criminalise and incarcerate someone into compliance. It just doesn't work. And the growing number or the growing size of our prison population, prisons disprove themselves. It's like the justice system is disproving itself simply because it's expanding. So it's actually not addressing the problem. And I understand a lot of people are happy with it that way, but maybe they shouldn't be. So, you know, what we really need is appropriate and effective and well-informed services. And that would include, from the things that the rest of the panel have spoken about today, obviously housing support, family violence support, alcohol and drug support, mental health support, child support, financial support. And because I'm not an Aboriginal woman, I think we also need to ask Aboriginal women what they need. You know, there's a lot of telling us what we need, but not a lot of asking us what it is we need to change this problem. And, you know, I was told that magistrates and police actually believe the service structure works, and I think you really have to be on the receiving end of that to realise that it doesn't work. And I say this respectfully, but I don't know, things look different from outside the fishbowl, I think. And you know, the service system is when it intersects with the justice system. It's actually used as a tool of surveillance, and it fails to meet needs, and then that further criminalises women. So I've seen a situation where someone's been housed in one area on bail, and their children have been taken away from them and are housed in an area that they're restricted from going to, and then they get breached because they want to go and visit their children. So that's where the service structure, for example, plays into actually increasing the number of charges that women will accrue while they're on bail. And, you know, I'd actually challenge any magistrate to strip their daughters of all resources and then subject them to the service system. If they've got a mental health issue and maybe a drug issue, let your daughters go through that service system and see how they fare without the resources that a lot of families are actually privileged enough to have. And, you know, if people are thinking, well, that could never happen to my daughter, then maybe we need to actually ask ourselves why. Why would that never happen to your daughter? So much of this is in the thinking and in our attitude to incarceration and criminalisation as a solution. And from my own experience, the thing I can say from, you know, in my many years of being criminalised and incarcerated is that the justice system actually taught me nothing and recovery taught me everything.
Thanks, Anna. That's a really powerful statement. So it sounds like, you know, there's been an increase in incarceration of women, and it sounds like also that, you know, it's a real gendered issue. Jill, can you talk about the broader system and what kind of response is needed to address this issue in a gendered way?
Sure way. And I speak about this as someone who's had multiple conversations with women over many, many years in the system, as someone who has been a part of the system and witnessed the system. Because I don't think that the broader service system has generally responded well to the needs of criminalised women, amongst others. I think the non-government service system it grew out of a grassroots movement to mobilise to transform the social conditions of people's lives. And I think the family violence sector in particular is a good example of this. However, what appears to me is that the lofty intentions that we all had to transform the social conditions that perpetuate, justify and normalise violence against women has really been congealed into social service agencies. So we have a service sector, we have safe houses, crisis support, legal advocacy organisations, public policy initiatives and community education. But really with work around defining violence, producing more resources and responding to crisis. So as a result, I think violence is seen as an individual and private problem rooted really in personal, familial gender dynamics. But what that hasn't made possible is the transforming of the historical, the social, the economical and political roots of violence. And I think more broadly across the service systems, we have, as Anna suggested, had a strong movement towards monitoring and surveillance. We're engaged in adjusting folks to the inhumanity of their life circumstances. We punish the most vulnerable for not finding a way to climb out of their structural poverty. Our work in the service system is often managing conditions and crisis situations for those struggling, but stiffening and expanding criminal penalties. Broad-based social change appears no longer to be our end goal. So I think, you know, like for me, in a world that hasn't delivered on justice, would not we want our work within the system to focus more on finding ways to do justice with individuals, families and communities, and in particular with stigmatised groups? You know, I kind of hold a hope that if we understand how groups of people are discriminated against and marginalised, we'll move more towards a position of standing alongside solidarity and wanting to dignify people. As Anna said, I certainly can concur. I have not witnessed brutality, punishment, shame, and humiliation as a great social change agent. I have seen compassion provide opportunities to understand our own privilege and what that might invisibilise in terms of the struggles of others. You know, in a recent exercise with the Women's Leadership Group, of which Anna and Sara are members of the Women Transforming Justice project, we were preparing a response to a community consultation interested in the needs of criminalised people. What I heard from these women were responses that spoke to having safe, stable, secure housing as an absolute, and the opportunity to belong and be connected to communities in ways that offered support and care. They wanted to be able to have wisdom that was shared across members of the community and opportunities to contribute through work or supporting others that were struggling to build knowledge and skills around surviving. I'm sure we can all identify with these aspirations. You know, women spoke to valuing lived experience as a production of knowledge with value in supporting others and advocating for changes to enhance the participation of criminalised women in society. I think the service system needs to centre truly and authentically those who've been most harmed, to advocate against injustices, and to understand that a lifetime of abuse and discrimination is not shared in 10 sessions. Which begs the question, what is healing within contexts of injustice? Because we're not often remembering folks back into communities. For many, membership has never been a privilege. A component of Women Transforming Justice, which is a project funded by the Victorian Legal Service Board and works to reduce the rising incarceration of women by focusing on supporting women to be bailed, Fitzroy Legal Services partners Flat Out and LACWA provide a legal non-legal response to women in the Magistrates Court. This collaboration that understands deeply the circumstances women present with supports women to meet these exceptional circumstances and to continue to provide respectful support to women across their bail period, centering the woman's voice, advocating into and across systems where women face unjust decisions or require more intensive support. The support often begins in the provision of crisis housing. If we consider the dignity of people, our connectedness, and our capacity to argue for structural change, I wonder what might become possible. There have been a number of situations where the presence of the flat-out caseworker and their commitment to support the woman has influenced the magistrate's decision to grant a woman bail. The service system may not be able to solve all the problems. However, we need to create space for social movements and community organising and offer a sustainable and meaningful pathway that supports agency in people's lives.
Thanks, Jill. So that's a very positive note to end with. I just wonder, Emma, since the report has been completed and your fieldwork completed, the kind of world has changed a little bit. Are you able to talk through what has changed since you completed the fieldwork in March and what you see as being the needs for change moving forward?
Yeah, it's definitely changed more than a little bit. Yeah, so the second stage of our fieldwork, we actually had to cease in March when the state of emergency was announced. So, you know, absolutely the COVID-19 pandemic has had a really significant impact on the whole of the criminal justice system. And just as we were getting ready to publish this report, we were able to access the Corrections Victoria statistics, which have shown that at the end of May this year, so only 2 months into the state of emergency, the women's prison population was already down 27% when compared to that time last year. So it's a really dramatic drop in the number of women that were in prison on that last day in May this year. And I think, you know, that shows us that when there is that will, and when there is that commitment to recognising that imprisonment causes significant harm, that women absolutely can be diverted from custody, very swiftly. And so we had, there was an important Supreme Court decision on 19th of March, where the court granted bail to a woman who had previously been denied bail twice in the magistrate's court. And so the judge considered that the COVID-19 related delays in the justice system did contribute to exceptional circumstances. And so the presence of the pandemic helped her to meet this test where she'd been previously unable to meet it. And in this case, the judge seemed to take into account that there were high risks of prison lockdowns, and that the absence of visits in prison would have a really significant impact on this mother in custody, who wouldn't be able to sustain her relationship with her kids in the same way. And a lot of this isn't necessarily out of the ordinary, right? Throughout the study, it was very clear that for women that have children, especially, their concerns for their kids' well-being, for their relationships with their kids, absolutely at the forefront of their minds. And so that's not unique to the pandemic, and this should always be, taken into account, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity that can be harnessed in this moment of paring back and of decarceration. Although we're in very stressful times, I think we can use this moment of downsizing the prison population as a learning opportunity for what can be built upon in the future. So that's why we really emphasize in what we're calling for is a broader approach that divests from prisons and policing. So really de-emphasizing carceral responses to social issues, so that funding and energy and resources can be redirected towards these community-based resources and support systems that, all of the speakers today have really highlighted are in dire need for women who are experiencing marginalisation and trauma, who are the ones that end up repeatedly in these cycles of injustice. I guess more closely to the issue of bail, it's absolutely evident that imprisonment is not being used as a last resort with the changes to the bail laws. And this has been gradually building, not only since the reforms in 2018, but prior to that, because women's remand rates have been increasing at a faster rate than men's over the past 5 years. So this is a longer trajectory, and we've very clearly moved away from imprisonment being a last resort for women. And this absolutely needs to change. And this is something that, should be prioritised in any kind of review and rethink of the bail laws. And now is the perfect time to do it as the prison population is shrinking.
Fantastic. I like that that phrase that you used, a moment of decarceration. All right, well, that's all the questions that I have. I'd like to thank you all for joining us on the panel today. So Sara, Anna, Jill and Emma, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And I've put some contacts there for people to make contact with us. I've also sent around a link to access the report. So please feel free to get in touch, and thanks again for joining us today.